Thank you, Shoshana, and welcome everyone to the first of two TA calls that we're having in November, one today and one next Thursday. Today we are featuring the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting, better known as CIFER, and their TA staff will review the regulatory foundations of IDEA Part B set-aside funds and raise considerations for making budget decisions. When states apply for IDEA Part B subgrants, SEAs must decide how to budget state set-aside funds for administration and other state-level activities. CIFER TA staff will review the federal requirements for IDEA Part B set-aside and highlight key concepts and considerations for SEAs as they budget these funds. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the call over to Dave Phillips, who is the director of CIFER. Dave.
Great. Thank you, Greg, for that nice introduction. Really appreciate it. Thank you to the Office of Special Education Programs for inviting us to this TA call today. We are looking forward very much to having a presentation and conversation about understanding IDEA Part B state set-aside funds. I'm going to kick us off today, talk a little bit about CIFER and how to, and most importantly, how to engage us. And then I'm going to, our other presenters are Elena Lincoln, who will be our primary presenter, and Steve Smith will be supporting questions and answers in the chat. Elena and Steve are both veteran technical assistance providers with the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting, have been with us since 2014, and have both been instrumental in standing up our state set-aside work starting this spring through now. So for our agenda today, as I already mentioned, I'll just spend a few minutes for those that may not be familiar with us, orienting folks to CIFER and most importantly, how to engage us. Elena will then talk about the regulatory foundations of Part B set-aside funds, transition to key considerations for making budget decisions about those funds, and then we'll wrap up for today. This session is more, as you all are familiar with, a pretty traditional OSEP technical assistance call format, so more of a presentation format. As Shoshana mentioned, you can put questions in the chat. We'll filter some of those that are for clarity on what's being presented. For more nuanced state-specific questions or complex questions, we have scheduled a open door session on December 7th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. The registration for that open door session on December 7th is available at our website. So I encourage folks to register there for follow-ups from today, as well as feel free to reach out to us for any additional questions and we can get right back to you. So just a little bit about what CIFER does. We support states to improve the quality of their collection, reporting, analysis, and use of IDEA Part B and Part C fiscal data. We were originally funded by the Office of Special Education Programs in 2014 to support Part B programs. We were grateful to be refunded in 2020, and in addition to Part B programs, we were also allowed the opportunity to provide support to Part C programs as well. In terms of what we do for Part B, we support a number of requirements: maintenance of state financial support, IDEA state set-aside funds, allocation of IDEA Part B subgrants to local education agencies, LEA maintenance of effort, and the fiscal components of coordinated early intervening services collection and reporting. IDEA state set-aside is a new area for us, relatively new area for us. OSEP clarified our scope in the spring of this year to support state set-aside. As I mentioned earlier, Steve and Elena and a number of our other TA specialists have been working to stand up a state set-aside team. We sort of soft launch technical assistance support over the summer, and this webinar is sort of a full announcement that we're open for business on providing technical assistance around the state set-aside requirements. Oops. So a key thing to know, especially as a follow-up from this presentation or other fiscal questions that you have, is how to engage us. On our website, cifer.wested.org, On the home page or any page at the top menu, there's a Contact Us item. When you click on that item, you'll be taken to a state drop-down menu. You can select your state. Every state, Part B and Part C program, has two state liaisons that are assigned. You can reach out to those folks with questions, big or small, if you're not already familiar with them, to get support on IDEA fiscal requirements. We do our level best to get back to folks within one business day. Once you get in touch with your state TA facilitators, they'll be able to walk you through resources and tools on the website. Many of them Cipher developed. They'll be able to also work with you on adapting those tools to your specific context. In addition, they'll make sure that folks with IDEA fiscal responsibilities in your state are aware of our listserv, which is sort of an old-fashioned email listserv that's closed with membership of Cipher technical assistance providers and state folks. And it's a great place to share information and ask questions of Cipher and of your peers. Our liaisons will also be able to introduce you to our communities of practice. Coming up in 2023, we'll be continuing to facilitate 4 communities of practice. One will be on fiscal timeline, those fiscal requirements that folks can be thinking about throughout the course of a year. State set-aside community of practice will also have a community of practice for those that are new to fiscal, on the job less than 18 months. And we'll also be doing a collaborative community of practice with the NCSI fiscal support team on the fiscal components of DMS. So a number of ways to get in touch with us. Transitioning to state set-aside, just for general framing to sort of get us started. In 2021, there was about $13 billion of IDEA Part B funds that were granted to states. Of that total amount in 2021, about $1.5 billion were available to set aside. Of that $1.5 billion, about $255 million, and these are all sort of roundish numbers, just for context, were available for state administration, and over $1 billion for other state level activities. Said another way, and this has helped me just to sort of think about proportions, for every $100 of Section 611 state grants, there's about $12 that's available to set aside on average, about $2 of those dollars for state administration, about 10 of those dollars available for other state level activities. When we think about 619 funds for 3 to 5, much smaller funding amount, given the smaller size, $104 million available to set aside. The formula is a little different than 611. 20% of that is the maximum for state administration. The remainder is available for other state level activities. It's a little harder to break out separately, but on average, if you think about 619 state grants, for every $100 of those grants, there's about $26 that's available for state set aside. In the information that we've looked at, it's about 3/4 of the states utilize all the funding that's available to them for set aside. And one of the reasons that it is particularly relevant now, as you've heard from Valerie Williams at the closing plenary at the IDEA Fiscal Forum this spring, and more recently from David Cantrell at NASD, there's because the state set aside is an inflation adjustment, and inflation is relatively high right now, there's an anticipated increase of about 8% in terms of the funding available to set aside in the upcoming year. That's not an insignificant amount of funding. In fact, that will be over $100 million. So more than the prior years, or about the same as, or even a little more than the prior years, 619 funding that was available to set aside. So now is a time to potentially really look at your state information, how you have set aside funds and distributed those funds in the past, and the budget considerations that you've made. It may present an opportunity to be even more intentional about how those funds are applied to current program initiatives in your all states. So with that general context, I'm now going to turn this over to Elena to get into a little more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, and welcome. And thanks for joining us, everyone, on the call. I'm going to take some time, a good chunk of our time today, to walk through IDA Part B state set-aside funds. You see some primary, just kind of core regulatory citations here. We're going to talk about what they are, how the maximum amounts are calculated, what some of the uses are, and then, as both Greg and Dave have mentioned, try to set the stage just for some considerations for you and your states and conversations that you may have after today. First, to put them in context, the state set-asides, really you start with the IDA Part B grants to states. There's Section 611 and 619 awards. So you see in the chart here, 611 awarded to eligible states, outlying areas, and freely associated states for implementation of Part B for children ages 3 through 21. And then Section 619 awarded to eligible states, as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico for children ages 3 through 5. In both cases, in both awards, there are certain amounts the state may set aside for Section 611 and 619 for state administration and other state level activities. Those are the two categories of state set-asides we'll talk about and are available to you under both awards. There's a little caveat on Section 611 you see here on this slide, that there are a couple required uses under 611. If you choose to reserve other state level activities, there are a couple activities that must be funded. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the uses. This is kind of where it starts. The IDEA Part B grants to states, and then a portion of those grant awards under 611 and 619 can be set aside for administration and other state level activities. The other thing I think to incorporate or think about when we're thinking about our state set-asides is the context of the rest of the grant money. So you receive, you see here in this, this is a graphic that Cipher has in a number of our resources, but it's looking at the state Part B grant, whether it's 611 or 619, and how it flows through. First, you set aside those amounts to the left in the gray, the state set aside in those two categories I mentioned. And then the amounts that are not set aside flow through. Those flow-through funds to LEAs as subgrants. Those subgrants follow a formula. The formula is comprised of base payments and then population and poverty amounts. And so just for context, the state set-aside comes off, the rest flows through to the LEAs, and your decision points about how much to set aside, how much to flow affects how much flows through to LEAs. So there is a maximum set-aside amount, and there are minimum flow-through amounts, and those amounts in between are where your decisions and considerations about how to use and budget your funds come in. All right, so let's talk about the maximum amounts and how those are calculated for both 611 and 619 set-asides. First, for Section 611, the state administration maximum, that amount is not more than the maximum amount the state was eligible to reserve for state administration for Section 611 for fiscal year 2004, or $800,000 adjusted for inflation. Whichever of those is greater, that's the maximum amount. For outlying areas, it's not more than 5% of the Section 611 grant the outlying area receives, or $35,000, whichever is greater. Those are how those amounts are calculated. Those are the parameters for that. They are calculated by the Office of Special Education Programs and provided to you in the grants to state summary table and imported into the interactive spreadsheet where you report your budget amounts in the state application, in the SEA application. One thing to note about this maximum amount here, and also you'll see for other state level activities, is that the amount is based on, it's tied to a particular amount award, 2004 award or 800,000, and adjusted for inflation. It is not based on or is not impacted by your current funding allocation or award amounts. So it is adjusted for inflation. That is why for Section 611, state administration and other state level activities, when you saw those ARP supplemental funds for IDEA come through, they flowed through to LEAs, and they did not increase those set aside amounts for your system because those set asides are based on this formula and aren't impacted by those award amounts. Okay, so for Section 611, other state level activities, based on slightly different, tied to a particular grant, an amount from a particular award, and then that maximum amount depends on a couple factors: whether the state administration set aside is up to 850,000 or greater than 850,000. And then also whether the state chooses to operate a high cost fund under their other state level activities or not. So those two decision points impact the maximum amount available. And then there's also an inflation adjustment for those amounts. For section 619, Dave mentioned this, 619 maximum amounts are calculated a little bit differently. The maximum amount, there's a maximum amount for the total reservation, and that's calculated at 25% of the state section 619 allocation from fiscal year 1997, adjusted by the lesser of the percentage of increase in the state's grant from the prior year or the rate of inflation, whichever is lesser there. So that's the total amount available for reservation under state set-asides. And then the state administration maximum is not more than 20% of the total reserve. And then the other state level activities amount, that's the difference between what the state reserves in total and what you reserve for administration. Okay, so once you have the maximum amounts, those are maximum amounts. So you make decisions, you have discretion on how much to set aside and how to allocate those amounts among a variety of uses. And so when thinking about those budget amounts and how much to reserve and where to put your funds, we thought we'd review some of the uses for both section 611 and 619 set aside funds. First, for 611 state administration, it's both categories. State administration is relatively straightforward. For 611, you can administer Part B. For 611 and 619, coordinating Part B activities, also providing technical assistance to other programs, providing services to children with disabilities, and then potentially administering Part C if your SEA is the lead agency. So those are some of the primary state administration uses. There are some additional options under state administration for section 611. The first is a Part C option. If the state receives a section 619 grant, you can develop and implement a policy to provide early intervention services to children eligible under 619 who previously received services under Part C until they enter or are eligible to enter kindergarten or elementary school for your state. So this is an optional component under state administration, the discretion of the state. And then the additional components here for state administration uses, you see in the second bullet, I think of it as other state level activities kind of embedded within administration. So those inflationary increases, the increases in your state administration amounts available due to the inflation increases, can be used for these 4 activities. And these are also activities that cross over to other state level activities. The first is support and direct services, including technical assistance, personnel prep, and PD and training, assisting LEAs in positive behavioral interventions and supports, mental health services for children with disabilities, and assisting LEAs in meeting personnel shortages, or supporting capacity building activities and improving delivery of services by LEAs in order to improve results for children with disabilities. So these activities are some targeted other state level activities that you can use your state administration funds for, those amounts that are due to inflation increases and adjustments. When it comes to other state level activities for 611, if you think back to that chart at the very beginning, we noted that there are some required uses for other state level activities under 611. And the way that this works is if you reserve any funds under other state level activities, then you must use some portion of those funds for these 2 activities. One is monitoring, enforcement, and complaint investigation, and 2 is establishing and implementing the mediation process. So you reserve other state level activities, you're going to have some funds in these 2 categories. And the amounts across states vary. We're going to give you some examples later, follow up on some of the data that Dave shared of how these other state level activities and administration funds are used. You can kind of get an idea of what portion is used for these activities. The other state level activities has a variety of other uses, permissible uses for you to decide what fits your state priorities and needs in implementing Part B. You'll see some of the items that we mentioned under state administration, the personnel prep and assisting LEAs with PBIS and mental health and some others. Then you also see support and improve the use of technology. That's another permitted use. We also see uses for development and implementation of transition programs and alternative programming, like services for children with disabilities in correctional facilities or state-supported schools, to support the development and provision of accommodations or alternate assessments for assessing the performance of children with disabilities. And then one that's not noted here is that you can support those TSI and CSI schools or LEAs within your state as well. So a final option under other state level activities, 611 funds, is the LEA high cost fund. You may use up to 10% of your section 611 amount set aside for other state level activities to finance a high cost fund and support innovative cost sharing by LEAs. So this particular option has additional requirements associated with and more details than what we have on the slide here. But one thing to note is that you must develop, SEAs must develop and annually review a state plan for the high cost fund. And then just as a side note, this is for financing the high cost fund. These other state level activities, funds for LEA high cost fund would not be used to administer the high cost fund or coordinate that fund. But you may set aside and use some of those state administration funds for that purpose. So if you choose to implement an LEA high cost fund, you can use up to 10% of those other state level activities funds you set aside. To do that, you develop a plan, review that annually, and then you need to look at other administration funds for administering that fund. This is also 611 specific, so you're not going to see this LEA high cost fund under section 619 uses. Okay, one additional caveat to the 611 other state level activities and administration funds is that states are required to describe how section 611 set aside amounts will be used to meet requirements of IDA Part B and be allocated to meet state priorities based on input from LEAs. So this is a provision you'll see from the citation. It's from the state eligibility section of the implementing regulations. It's not housed in the same area as those allotment and allocation and use regulations, but it's something to keep in mind. You'll see this in section 3 of the SEA application. You're required to submit a description of that process along with your budgeting details of how you're going to be using those funds to meet the requirements and state priorities based on input from those LEAs. So we just have a question in here just as kind of a takeaway for you to think about: how is input gathered from LEAs considered, documented when you're making decisions about the use of state level set aside funds, and just making sure you're prepared to submit that description. And potentially, as you consider or write up procedures for the set asides processes in your state, you want to consider including written procedures regarding LEA input. So that was quite a bit. That was just section 611, uses for other state level activities administration. Now we're going to start with 619, administration. Those funds reserved may be used for the purposes of administering section 619 and potentially Part C. So pretty straightforward. Administering, that's the administering, implementing, coordinating the implementation of 619 for your state. For other state level activities under 619, there are several permissible uses, not as many as under 611, but quite a few options for those funds. You see here for support services, including mediation process, which may, and there's a note, which may benefit children with disabilities younger than 3 or older than 5, as long as the services benefit those children aged 3 through 5. Then also direct services for children with disabilities aged 3 through 5. Activities at state and local levels to meet those state performance goals. And then we have a few more supplementing other funds used to develop and implement a statewide coordinated services system. And that has a caveat. We don't have it on here, but there is a cap on that. There's a 1% of the 619 award for your state. So that's a limited amount. And then to provide early intervention services to children with disabilities eligible under 619, previously received Part C services until they are entering or eligible to enter kindergarten or elementary school in your state. that should look familiar. So that was a provision we saw earlier under section 611 state administration. So this is an option under 611 administration. It's also an option for 619 other state level activities. So you'll see there's some cross-cutting and overlap among the potential uses of the different set-aside funds here. And then another one to continue service coordination or case management for families who receive services under Part C. Okay, so that was quite a bit on the uses and maximum amounts and how they're calculated, some of those technical requirements. We wanted to take some time for this second half here of our presentation is to look at some of the budgeting data we have on recent years of how these funds have been budgeted, and also bring out some key considerations that you may use to take away for conversations or just some considerations you have in your state as you approach this next SEA application and your state application process for this coming year. First, a little pause and reflect, and this kind of setting you up for the data slides we're going to share here in just a few minutes. First, how does your state use 611 funds? And we're thinking about 611 state administration, other state level activities. If you were to think about that, how are those funds used? Maybe what are the top 3 uses of those set aside funds in your state? And then maybe also thinking about how have those changed, or have they changed and shifted for your state recently? And so just take a moment to kind of think about that and set the stage. And we're going to share some data about how these funds have been used in aggregate across the country. Okay, so I'm going to start going through some more data. This slide looks familiar from what Dave shared earlier to set the stage for our presentation. And this is giving us a little more detail. So when you're thinking about your own state, you can see how you compare to this aggregate information. This is, we're looking at state administration in 43 states. And you see here, for every $100 of Section 611 state grants available in FY 2021, $1.99, about $2 was available for state administration, and $1.93 was reserved. So that's a pretty substantial portion. Virtually all of the available funds are reserved. It's about 97%. So you can kind of, and this is based on the 43 states we had data aggregate, we're able to aggregate here. And then in the chart to the right, the box, you see we've broken that down a little bit for you. And so from that $2, $1.77 was on Part B administration. And this is on state administration funds. So that's probably no surprise. That's kind of the big bucket category, $1.77. Do you also see some other things where you're spending those state administration dollars? The lower end being on personnel shortages, Part C administration, but predominantly Part B administration for those dollars, $1.77 of the $1.93 reserved. Now, if we take a look at other state level activities in those states, for every $100 of 611 state grants from 21, we have $9.84 that was available for other state level activities, and $9.31 was reserved. So again, the vast majority of the available funds were reserved, and I think it's about 95% of those funds are reserved. Breaks down a little differently. There are more activities first that you can use these funds on, and a little more variety potentially for how those funds are used. I just want to note too that these are averages and aggregate data. So it doesn't mean that every state spent money on all of those items. It's just the average amount for each item. So first of all, at the top, you see $2.88 on direct services and TA. And you see toward the top also there capacity building and PBIS, quite a bit, 91 cents on monitoring and enforcement. So, but the top level there definitely $2.88 on direct services and TA of the $100 in funds. And then toward the lower end, technology, 10 cents, mediation, paperwork reduction. You see some of those toward the lower end, but quite a variety of uses in there and a variety of amounts being spent. So we know a lot has happened in the last 3 or 4 years around the country. And so not the least of which is pandemic, economic changes. And so we thought we'd look at 611 other state level activities over time. We're able to do that comparing FFY 17 to FFY 2021. So this slide, you see the 2017 in the light blue, the 2021 in the dark blue, and the activities of the other state level activities are noted at the bottom. And I'm just at a glance being able to identify a couple trends that you see or changes that you see. One is that it looks like we're spending more, noticeably more on direct services, TA, and then transition seems to have a pretty decent jump over there on the far right. So direct services and TA is the tall one in the center, getting close to 30%, and transition over to the right with an increase. The other couple that stand out would be some places where we've shifted downward in this, and that would be capacity building, monitoring and enforcement. See some downward shifts there as well. So just to kind of think about how have these changes, how have your funds potentially changed over time, and see what this looks like, at least in aggregate, based on this data available. Okay, sorry, extra slide. So there was quite a bit of data, possible uses that we've shared today. We wanted to also just throw out some questions that we think are just considerations you might have for state conversations and just reflection for you individually or with your team. And some of those questions you see here: how does your state make and document processes and decisions regarding IDEA state set-aside funds? Is this process different for 619 and 611? And then also, as you saw from the last slide, considering events and changes over the last 4 years, what has changed in reserving or expending these funds in the state, or have they? And then to what extent are your state level activities driven by other data about your state system and improved outcomes from children with disability? What are those factors you look at in making decisions in how you're going to budget the state set-asides for your state? And then how do you know, or do you have methods for evaluating how those funds you currently reserve are being used? Are they being used effectively? So these are some considerations as you enter another application season soon and looking at your state set-aside amounts, and then hopefully having some perspective given that aggregate data we're able to share. Okay. So the other thing, as Dave mentioned, we've been building up and excited to be able to provide technical assistance in the state set-aside content area. We wanted to highlight a few of our existing CIFER resources that may be helpful to you and your teams as you look at state set-asides. So the first one is IDA Part B Fiscal Timeline. So this is a tool that you're able to customize for your system, and it includes a wealth of information and steps and tasks related to a variety of IDA fiscal topics. We also have the IDA Part B allocations at a glance. It's a document that is a one-page, provides some key considerations as well as a graphic regarding allocations, focused a little more on the LEA flow through, those LEA subgrants amounts, but can be helpful in the context of state set-asides. And then also understanding the IDA Part B state grant funding cycle in different fiscal years. This is a document that's helpful, especially maybe stakeholders or members on the team who are trying to get that fiscal year and period of performance and understanding the grant cycle and timeframes associated with those IDA Part B grants. So those resources may be ones you'd like to check out. And then we wanted to pause, just take a few minutes. If you have any particular questions, you may have questions that are more those kind of questions you want to bring to the open door on December 7th that Dave announced, or reach out to your CIFER TA liaison. But if you have questions for us and you want to put those into the Q&A, Steve and I will kind of work through looking at those and seeing what we can do to follow up with you today on this call. So any questions about what we've shared today?
Elena, I see one in the Q&A from Kara Williams, and she's asking, Do we have physical data regarding investments in Part C SIP related activities?
Okay, yes, thanks, Greg, and thanks, Kara, for that question. I do not believe so, but we can do some double checking, or Dave may want to weigh in on that. I believe that for the most part, what data we presented today is that aggregate data on this particular information is what we had available.
Right. That's right, Elaine. I think we would need to work with OSEP on understanding what might be available there in general. So that's something we can get back to Kara on for sure.
Okay, thanks for that, Kara. So that's we'll get back to you or see what kind of data we might be able to do in that area. Any other questions? Feel free to keep to consider those and put them into the Q&A as we continue here. But I'm going to go ahead and walk through a couple more slides before we close out. If you think of questions afterwards, of course, you can always reach out to Cypher as well. But feel free to put more questions in the Q&A if you have any. Okay, David mentioned these, but this is good to kind of have a slide to remind you. Very excited to have our December 7th open door session on state set aside. So a chance to really collaborate with others around the country and have Cypher TA support there. The announcement has gone, the registration information is on our website, and have a listserv announcement regarding that. So pencil that in on your calendars and join us for the open door session on state set asides December 7th. And then, as Dave mentioned, Cypher provides communities of practice. We're doing another round in 2023, and one of those communities of practice will be on state set-asides. We're going to have more information on those and registration information and such available soon, and those should kick off in January, so kind of have that in mind as well. All right, I think I see. I'm just going to check real quick.
We have one more question. Well, actually, we have two questions now. First question, will there be an IDA Part B fiscal forum in 2023?
I'll take that one, Steve. We are planning to have a couple of face-to-face convenings for Part B in 2023, and then have our Part B fiscal forum in the spring of 2024. We're having a Part C IDA fiscal forum in May of this year. So we're sort of alternating years with C and B, and then having some other on-site events to be announced for Part B this year for 2023.
Thank you, Dave. And then we have another question that just came in. It says, you asked a question about how states know funds are being used effectively. I think that was the word. Did you get any answers? What would you say are answers to that? Improvement indicators on APR. So I think we didn't get any answers in this session. I think that's probably one that we would definitely like to talk more about at the open door session in December, and probably also on the community of practice that'll be starting up in January and going through next year. So we don't have any answers yet because we haven't had any interactions with states on what they think the answers are in their context, but definitely something that we want to talk about as we move forward.
Okay, thanks, Steve and Jerry and others for those great questions. Do we have any others before we go on? I think
looks like we got one more about funds set aside for CEIS. How does the state know it is being used efficiently? Only from the LEA CIS reports. So I think probably yes, that the only real knowledge that anyone would have around the use of the funds for CEIS at the LEA level would be whatever the states require their LEAs to report to them. So for discussions on that, I believe we're having a CEIS community of practice as well. But from my understanding, what we know about CEIS and the use of funds at that level is really individual state-based, what they collect and require their districts to report, which is, varies from state to state on what level of detail they get.
Okay. Thank you. More great questions, and thanks, Steve, for processing those for us. If you have more questions, feel free to pop them in, just like one more slide, or come to the open door, or send them to your Cipher TA liaison. We've got a contact us slide here. We've mentioned these, they've been in the chat earlier, but feel free to reach out not only to our website, but also you can email just the Cipher email. If you don't know who to email, you can send it to that and they'll get it to the right, to a TA liaison for your area. Also on our website, it does have a list of who the TA liaisons are for your state. So if you're not familiar, you want to reach out, you can check that there. As well as this is where our resources that we mentioned today and other resources as we develop them over time will be. So that's all we had for today. I really appreciate the chance to present to you all. And I want to thank Dave and Steve and the rest, many players at Cipher for preparing this information and getting it ready, and to Greg and OSEP for hosting us today. And I'm going to send it back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Elena. And I want to thank you and Dave and Steve for walking us through this content. I know many people move into the state level jobs, having been experts in special education programming, but may not have the same kind of budgetary chops that you need to really kind of figure out how a pretty significant amount of state level IDEA funds will be used. So it's really important that we understand these requirements. And I think you did a really nice job of, in a very short amount of time of walking us through those. One point that I really wanted to emphasize is that, it's really important to not just do the same thing that you did last year and the year before that, but to really be thoughtful about how your state level funds are going to be used. And I think that's particularly significant given that we're expected there will be a pretty large increase next year in the available state level funds. So that provides some real opportunities for states to think about what the critical needs are in their state and how they can use those funds to improve those issues, improve areas in those issues. So thanks again for doing that. I want to plug our call next Thursday, November 17th. We'll be conducting a TA call about the eligibility requirements for children suspected of having visual impairments, including blindness. During the call, presenters will review the components of OSEP Memo 1705 and address continued confusion around visual impairment requirements. So I urge you all to mark that on your calendars and join us at 4 o'clock next Thursday, the 17th. So I think that wraps it up for today. I want to wish everybody a really happy Veterans Day. We at the federal level get that as a holiday, and I suspect many of you do as well. So enjoy the extra time and take care. We hope to see you next week.